Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I've got an interesting little upgrade that I've just done that I thought I'd share with you guys. This is a little speaker from LSA called the LSA Signature 50. And I've done some work for this company in the past, and a couple years ago the owner of the company sent me what I think was the LSA 1, which was a similar bookshelf size speaker that he was having some trouble with woofers going out on, and he didn't have replacement woofers, and I think this was a model that was produced prior to the particular owner buying the company. So he sent it to me, and I dropped one of our M165 woofers into it and designed a new crossover for it and made a little kit that fixed all those models that were out there that had a need for some new woofers. So this time though, this one wasn't sent to me by the company. This was sent to me by a customer. And first thing I noticed was that the cabinets looked really nice. I mean, this is just a good looking cabinet. It's got this textured, I don't know what you call this stuff. It's almost like a vinyl wrap that they put around it that kind of has a leathery texture to it. Really nice. And the side panels look like a solid chunk of wood. They are not. This is some type of pressed veneer or something that they put on this that looks very much like really nice wood, but it's just MDF. It is a totally unbraced box, and it does need a little bracing in there somewhere, but it is what it is. It looks nice. And first thing I did was just set it up and shoot a frequency response on it to see what's going on. And as soon as I shot it, I heard it, and I thought, ooh, that sensitivity is way low. Maybe something happened here, and maybe one of my guys bumped the volume control on the amplifier there, and it didn't output 1 watt. So I readjusted it and checked it and made sure it was at 1 watt and shot it again. And sure enough, I could tell by hearing it, sensitivity was pretty low on this thing. So let's take a look at the frequency response as I saw it. And yeah, it looked pretty rough. That's a pretty choppy response, and it is nowhere near the 86 dB that this speaker is listed at. There's a few little peaks there that just get above 95 just a little bit, but other than that, if you took a line and drew it right down the middle of this roughness, it would be about 82 dB sensitivity. It's a little higher than that on the woofer end, 94.5, 95, somewhere right, 84.5 to 85 right in there. And it's quite a bit lower on the tweeter end. In fact, the average sensitivity on the tweeter end is also about 82 dB. So it sounded off. And I thought, oh boy, look at that peak at just before 2 kHz. I bet that's going to be a problem. And so I immediately looked at the spectral decay, and this is what I saw in the spectral decay. Yeah, that's about as bad as it gets. That resonance right there at like 1950, between 1900 and 2000 hertz, just right there. Ooh, that, again, that is about as bad as it gets, and that makes this little driver pretty much unusable in a two-way system. This is what we'd call a paperweight at this point. I take that back. Well, you could series parallel about 4 of these and use it in a slim tower where you've got a woofer covering from 200 hertz and down only. This would cover from 200 hertz down to 50 hertz without too much of a problem, but playing it above that range and letting it get up to any higher frequency range is pretty much a no-go. So I thought, okay, let's look at what's going on here and look at the information that was available on the internet, and I was able to find the frequency response measurement that was posted by the guy who supposedly designed this thing. And as I looked at it and began to read on it, it really wasn't a measured frequency response. It was what's called a predicted response. So let me explain that. A predicted response is where you take a factory measurement that's in an infinite baffle, and you take that response and you predict what it might do with a certain filter on it. And it was the same for the tweeter. You take the tweeter's response and you calculate a predicted roll-off and you look at the predicted response. The problem is with those predicted responses is they really don't take into account the driver offset very well. They don't take into account the diffraction from the baffle. They don't take really into account the surface area that's around the driver so much. And it's really a lot different than the actual response. In this case, so if you look at this predicted response, that peak that you see right in that same frequency range, right around 1950 hertz, it's there in the predicted response. So it was there in the manufacturer's response. They should have thrown up some red flags. It doesn't look as bad in the predicted response because of the scaling. If you look at the scaling we use, we zero in on things a little bit tighter to take a little better look at them. And we're showing a lot bigger spread after that. There's a much bigger dip. And that's because that's an actual measured response and not a predicted response. So I could see then that, yeah, it's not just me. This thing really does have that massive amount of ringing. It just was never measured from the factory for the guys who designed this to really see what was going on. Also, the crossover point was really high on this thing, where this thing had no business playing above 200 or 300 hertz. It was crossed at like 3,800 to 4,000 hertz. So what happens when you cross it at that high a frequency? Well, let's look at the horizontal and vertical off-axis responses, and let's see what that high crossover point does in that regard. If we look at horizontal off-axis, we see not only is the tweeter dropping off in the off-axis, but the woofer's response is dropping off in the off-axis because it's playing up so high. So the horizontal off-axis just collapses as you get left or right. Also, the vertical off-axis, because the wavelengths are so short at the crossover point, there's so much overlap, as you start moving up and down, the cancellation patterns are pretty significant. There's huge holes in the response, and it just becomes a mess. And then if we look at just the impedance curve, we can see that it was just, again, it was a textbook slope that was calculated response, and it looks okay. It's a little high on the tweeter end, but overall, the impedance is not a problem. Now, if you look at the crossover that came in this thing, and I'll show you a picture of the crossover, it actually has some polycaps on it. It has some decent resistors. They're not little sandcast resistors. It has an air core inductor on the tweeter, but on the woofer there's an iron core inductor. And then, you know how I like iron core inductors playing up into the mid-range. And then there was the binding post cup, which the actual binding posts on this are brass, and even the nuts on the back are brass. But however, the terminals, the tabs that were soldered to, those are steel. Oh, the steel terminals. And of course, the wiring had all the little 10 push-on connectors as common PVC jacketed wire. So there was a lot left on the table on this one, and I thought because the woofer's response is so bad, like I said, this is, for a two-way speaker, it's totally unusable. It's a paperweight, and I thought, what the heck am I going to do with this thing? There's no fixing this. And then I remembered whenever I did a fix for the old LSA 1, we used one of our woofers to drop in there and turned it into a nice little speaker. And I thought, I wonder if I can do this again. I wonder if our woofer would fit this hole. And so I dropped one of our woofers in there, and it was pretty close. I mean, the actual interior hole here was the right size. The airspace is about right. All we really needed was to 3D print one of these little beauty rings here. It's not really a beauty ring. A little spacer there to drop in to fill that gap there. And then our woofer just dropped right on top of it, and it fit great. There's a gasket already on there under this. Then this fits on top, and then our woofer's got a gasket on it. So it was a no-brainer to just drop one of our M165s in there and see what I could do with this thing. So I did that, and then the first thing I had to do was look at the tweeter's response. And I'm not a big fan of this little Dayton tweeter. It is a metal dome tweeter. It can be a little harsh. And then let's look at the frequency response, and you'll see it drops pretty heavy right at 3 kHz. There's a hole in the response, and it's about a 5 dB hole. So I thought, oh boy, I got my work cut out for me here. I'm going to have to get real creative with the crossover, and what I had to do was do something like a notch filter at the very first of the network, where I'm using an inductor to let the lows pass right where that dip is. I'm using a resistor across it to bring all the top part of it down, and then because the very top was rolled off, I was having to put a small cap on it to bring that very top back up. So I was having to do some shaping of the response before I put a filter on it, and then I was able to put a second order filter on it and get a reasonable smooth response out of it. And I tried some higher order filters, and I tried some craftiness there to try and lift that area there a little more, and back and forth. And the higher order filter I put on the less it would play into the low frequency. I just couldn't, there was no free lunch there. There had to be some compromises. So I wound up doing a second order filter on it. I got a reasonable response, and our little woofer is easy to control. It just needed a second order filter as well. And I had a pretty flat response. And then I started looking at the vertical off axis, because this does have slightly tilted front baffle. And it became more in phase as I went up using that order of filter. And then it got right there at the crossover point, it started to hump up a little bit. So I thought, I want it to be flat over a wider range. So I went back to the on axis and I revoiced it a little bit, and I brought the tweeter level down a little more, and I softened it through that area just a little bit, because as you go up vertically, that stuff starts coming up. And that worked out really well. In fact, let's look at the crossover response that I've got on there. That's where I ended up with it. And then let's look at the horizontal off axis compared to the original horizontal off axis. You notice now we're just looking at the off axis of the tweeter dropping off as we get further and further off axis. We're not looking at holes in the response or dropping off in the lower frequency range, because all of that's covered by the tweeter, which it wasn't before because the crossover point was so high. And now if we look at the vertical off axis, we see it maintaining a consistent response over a wide range. We look at it compared to the original vertical off axis, it's a pretty dramatic difference. And here's where it really makes a big difference. Let's look at the spectral decay. And I know you guys have started seeing me post this stuff enough that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. With this little woofer, it plays and it stops. It just does not have stored energy to it. The decay rate is really fast. And the same with the tweeter. It just decays really well, and we see a clean roll-off, versus the original. There was massive amount of ring. I don't know how anybody could have listened to that speaker the way it was and not notice that there was a massive amount of ringing right there. That was about as bad as I've seen. And so that's what I was able to do with it. The new frequency response is right at 87 dB, which is a little higher than it was even originally predicted. It was supposed to be an 86 dB speaker. It was nowhere near that. So the crossover is not complex. This is everything that you see here on the table. We've got just one big inductor and a poly cap. I'm going to use the JB cap there in the woofer circuit. The tweeter, we've got one small inductor there at the crossover and one at the front as part of that notch filter that's balancing everything out. And I did choose to use some sonic caps right there in that part of the circuit to bring some clarity and detail to this tweeter. So the parts count was fairly low. It did bring the cost up a little bit for the sonic caps, and we've got two of our woofers that are $34.95 a piece, which are not expensive at all. It did require some tube connectors to replace these because that was bad. And you could mount the tube connectors into the old cup if you want to drill it out there. You could drill a hole in the back of the cabinet and mount these right above the binding post cup and parallel them if you want, so you can use either or. If you are going to parallel it, I would say find some brass tabs and get these steel ones out of the path. That way you can use tube connectors, or you can use the regular binding posts. I love it when you do that because you always tell me how much better it sounds with the tube connectors. We did a shootout here last week with a reviewer that was here where we went tube connectors, binding posts. We went back and forth. He was surprised at just how much difference there was in going to the tube connectors. We're going to throw in a sheet of no-res on this. It really needs it. I know that was probably really loud, the microphone sitting on the table. Sorry about that, guys. And all new wiring, and the rings, we're figuring $10 for printing off some of the rings. All total, this thing came to $509 for the upgrade and fix for this thing, which is not bad because the original speaker, these things sold for only $599. And for that, you're getting a reasonable tweeter and you're getting a pretty nice box. So you're getting some bones there that you can work with. You just need to gut the crossover, throw that woofer away or use it for a paperweight, and then install all the newer parts. And the result is going to be a pretty great sounding little speaker that you'll have for under $1,100 that you could be proud of. I know how these woofers sound. We use them in everything, and it's a phenomenal little driver, and I know you guys are going to love it. And it's an easy upgrade to do, and I hope you guys have some fun with it. All of you guys who have this Signature 50 model, I'm not sure whose signature that this is supposed to be, because I wouldn't have put my signature on that one, but it is what it is, and there is an easy fix. So that's it for this one. I appreciate you guys watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.